On a humid December night in 1989, the lights of Panama City glared off shattered glass and burned-out cars. American helicopters thumped overhead, U.S. armored vehicles blocked intersections, and somewhere in the chaos, a dictator with a $1 million price on his head was running out of places to hide. Manuel Noriega had ruled Panama for years in the shadows, playing double games with intelligence agencies, drug cartels, and superpowers. Now Operation Just Cause had torn his regime apart in a matter of days. His barracks had fallen, his troops had deserted, his safe houses had been stripped away one by American special forces using night vision, satellites, and a level of precision he had never fully believed the United States would unleash against him. He had one card left, not an army, not a bunker, a building, a simple walled compound flying a yellow and white flag, the Apostolic Nunciature, the Vatican's embassy in Panama. On Christmas Eve, Noriega picked up a secure line and called the papal nuncio, Archbishop José Sebastián Laboa. He didn't ring Moscow, he didn't turn to old military allies, he turned to the smallest sovereign entity on earth, betting that the Holy See's unique diplomatic status could shield him where sandbags and soldiers had failed. Minutes later, a convoy slipped through the streets and into the nunciature grounds. The gates closed behind Noriega. Outside, U.S. troops formed a ring of steel around the Vatican mission. Inside, a man who had once thought of himself as untouchable sat down in a simple room, realizing that his last hope was not a tank column, but the centuries-old concept of diplomatic immunity. For an American audience, the image is unforgettable. A swaggering strongman, once a CIA asset, now hiding behind the walls of a church-run embassy, while U.S. forces, backed by overwhelming technology and global intelligence, boxed him in. But to really feel how strange and powerful that moment is, you have to rewind the story. Because the Noriega standoff was not an isolated oddity. It was the latest chapter in a much longer, often hidden history. The way the Vatican's special legal status, its embassies, its extraterritorial churches, its moral authority intersected with Cold War politics, fugitives on the run, and an American technological machine that turned every such crisis into an opportunity. In World War II and its aftermath, the world learned what happens when borders are drawn in blood. Millions of people were uprooted. Some of them had crimes to answer for. Others were fleeing new regimes that claimed to speak for the people but ran on secret police files and show trials. In that chaos, tiny Vatican City, a handful of walled acres in the heart of Rome, suddenly mattered in a new way. It wasn't just a religious capital, it was a subject of international law, with its own territory, its own citizenship, and soon a network of embassies, apostolic nunciatures, whose buildings could not be entered by local police without permission. Those walls and that status could mean life or death. Take the case of Vissarion Puiu, a Romanian Orthodox metropolitan bishop whose story sounds like it belongs in a Cold War spy novel. During the war, Romania had fought alongside Nazi Germany. After the war, a communist government took over and began rewriting the nation's moral ledger. Puiu, who had once held high ecclesiastical office, was sentenced to death in absentia by a people's court for collaboration and war crimes. He fled west. For a time, he lived in monasteries in northern Italy, then in hotel rooms, moving in the shadows as new regimes consolidated power back home. Romanian authorities pressed for his return. Communist propaganda painted him as a traitor and agent of the Vatican. They wanted to haul him back across the Iron Curtain in chains. Inside the Catholic Church, opinions were divided. Some saw him as compromised. Others saw him as a fellow Christian hierarch facing a regime with no respect for due process. But one thing united Vatican officials behind closed doors: a deep distrust of communist courts. Whatever Puyo had done, they did not want his fate decided in a political show trial in Bucharest. So Catholic networks quietly arranged something unusual. Instead of leaving him exposed in a random Italian town, they explored housing him in buildings that did not fully belong to Italy in the ordinary sense. One of those options was the Great Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, an extraterritorial possession of the Holy See in Rome. On Italy's maps, this basilica and a handful of other sites sat within Italian territory, but under the Lateran Treaty, they enjoyed a special status. Italian police could not simply walk in, rummage around, and drag someone out, especially if the Vatican objected. In internal correspondence, Vatican officials frankly discussed the need to keep Puyo hidden as much as possible, precisely because he had been sentenced to death in Romania. They arranged for him to stay in religious houses and monastic communities linked to the Holy See, moving him when necessary, always balancing charity, church politics, and the risk of communist spies discovering his location. From Moscow's point of view, this was infuriating. Here was a man they believed symbolized collaboration and reaction, being sheltered under Catholic roofs with the help of an institution barely 1/2 of 1 square kilometer in size. They could rail in state newspapers, they could send angry notes, but they could not simply send agents into an extraterritorial basilica in Rome and snatch him. Now zoom out and see how this looks on a systems level, not just a personal one. While Eastern Bloc regimes were perfecting the art of internal surveillance, dossiers, informants, show trials, the West, led by the United States, was building something different. It was creating an international legal and diplomatic environment in which even a microstate like the Vatican could serve as a spoiler against totalitarian control. Washington did not control the Holy See, but American policymakers understood its value. Here was a globally respected moral actor with embassies, confidants, and contacts in places where American diplomats could not always go, playing a parallel game of protection and pressure. At the same time, American technology, from secure transatlantic cables to early computers in foreign ministries, meant that when the Vatican quietly raised concerns about a persecuted bishop or a threatened refugee, those messages could be relayed, logged, and folded into broader Western strategy with a speed and precision the Soviet system could not easily match. To a Kremlin fixated on steel and tanks, it was unsettling to realize how much influence could be packed into legal clauses, telephone lines, and postage stamp pieces of extraterritorial land. Now take the story thousands of miles away, into the furnace of Latin America in the 1970s. On September 11, 1973, Chile's democracy blew apart. Jets bombed the presidential palace in Santiago. President Salvador Allende died in his office. A military junta under General Augusto Pinochet seized power. From one day to the next, activists, trade unionists, left-wing politicians, and foreign exiles living in Chile found themselves on wanted lists. Arrests multiplied, torture centers filled, bodies began appearing by the roadside. Faced with this terror, thousands of people did something that would have been almost unimaginable in the Soviet bloc. They ran not for the mountains, but for embassies. Because in Latin America, a unique legal tradition had flourished since the 19th century: diplomatic asylum. Foreign missions, especially in political crises, could open their gates and offer protection to those hunted by their own governments, banking on regional treaties and customs that recognized such asylum as legitimate. In Santiago, the embassies of Sweden, Mexico, Argentina, and many others suddenly turned into lifeboats. Courtyards filled with mattresses, offices became dormitories. On the walls, national flags fluttered over crowds of people who no longer trusted their own flag to keep them alive. The Catholic Church in Chile moved quickly. Under the moral pressure of Pope Paul VI and later John Paul II, local bishops set up the Vicaria de la Solidaridad, a church-run office that documented disappearances, provided lawyers, and organized basic aid. Monasteries and convents became discreet refuges. Priests and nuns helped people move from safe house to safe house. And in this crowded, dangerous ecosystem, the Apostolic Nunciature, the Vatican's embassy, occupied a very special place. It was at once a diplomatic mission and a religious symbol. Assaulting it outright would have shocked millions of Chilean Catholics and triggered a global backlash. We do not have a comprehensive list of everyone who set foot inside the nunciature seeking protection, but we know that at least one high-level leftist militant, Nelson Gutierrez of the MIR, ran to a Vatican office in 1975 to ask for refuge when his life was on the line. We know that other church buildings like the Notre Dame Convent on Padre Orellana Street functioned as sanctuaries for people the regime branded extremists. For a junta that believed it could control every square block of its capital with soldiers and curfews, this was infuriating. Within their own city, there were pockets of walls they did not fully command: foreign embassies, UN buildings, and yes, Vatican premises. Inside those walls, people on their wanted lists were sleeping, eating, and preparing to leave the country with the help of the very international system they denounced as imperialist. Here again, American power came into the picture in a way that combined moral stance and technological muscle. As Chilean refugees packed into embassies across Latin America, Western governments, Canada, Sweden, France, and the United States among them, began coordinating resettlement. telex machines chattered day and night. UNHCR offices sent lists. Church agencies like the World University Service and Catholic Charities compiled case files and transmitted them to Washington, Ottawa, and European capitals. In diplomatic cables and immigration databases, the story of every person sheltered in an embassy became a piece of structured information: name, age, background, risk level, destination. This was not the old world of random ad hoc favors. It was an emerging, data-driven system for managing political exile. To the Soviet bloc, which had built elaborate internal records on dissidents but lacked comparable, open, transnational resettlement machinery, this was a different kind of power. The West had not only the will to call these people refugees, it had the technology and bureaucracy to receive them, track them, move them, and integrate them. And in many of those stories, the first step on that journey had been a frantic knock on a door bearing the Vatican's coat of arms. Now, come back to Noriega in 1989, sitting in a simple room in the papal nunciature, with the sound of helicopters outside and American troops ringed around what was technically foreign soil. For centuries, inviolability of embassies had been a matter of custom and treaties. Article 22 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations states bluntly that the premises of a mission are inviolable. Agents of the host state may not enter without consent, and the host must protect them from intrusion. That legal line is what Noriega was counting on. If American troops treated the nunciature as just another building to kick down the door of, it would smash not only international law, but also the Vatican's carefully guarded role as an independent moral actor in world affairs. But what Noriega underestimated was the way American power had evolved. This was not 1527, with mercenary armies storming Rome. This was the late Cold War, with satellite reconnaissance, special forces playbooks, and psychological warfare manuals. The United States did not have to violate the walls. It could surround them, monitor every signal going in and out, and apply a different kind of pressure. Delta Force and Navy SEAL units had already ripped apart his military infrastructure in Operation Nifty Package. Now, outside the nunciature, U.S. troops deployed banks of loudspeakers and blasted deafening music and noise day and night, a form of psychological warfare aimed at reminding Noriega that his world had shrunk to a few rooms and that his time was running out. Inside, Archbishop Laboa moved with a different kind of strategy. According to accounts from the time, he had given Noriega merely 10 minutes to decide whether to enter, made him promise to halt resistance, and from the beginning treated his presence not as a permanent asylum, but rather as a temporary refuge whose purpose was to engineer a surrender. Soon, the Holy See clarified publicly that it did not consider Noriega to have asylum in the strict sense, but rather to be a person in refuge. Behind the scenes, Vatican diplomats pressed for a solution that would respect international law, Panama's sovereignty, American interests, and the Holy See's unique role in world affairs. For days, Noriega prayed in the chapel, attended Mass, listened to homilies about the thief on the cross and the shifting loyalty of earthly powers. Outside, American intelligence tracked every development, communicated with Rome and the new Panamanian government, and calibrated exactly how far to push the psychological campaign without crossing the line into a physical breach of Vatican territory. In the end, Noriega walked out on his own, wearing his uniform, carrying his Bible, escorted by priests to the gate where U.S. agents were waiting. He was flown to Miami, tried and convicted in American courts. The nunciature walls had never been touched by a battering ram. The principle of inviolability had held, and yet the dictator who had banked on that inviolability to save him still ended up in a U.S. prison cell. From a Soviet perspective, and from the standpoint of any regime built on hard power and fear, this outcome is deeply instructive. They had long understood force. What they were now confronting, indirectly, was something more complex, an U.S.-led West that could honor diplomatic law, respect the sanctuary of a Vatican mission, and still deploy intelligence, technology, and patient pressure to achieve its goals. It's the same pattern that had played out for decades in quieter ways. When a bishop hid in an extraterritorial basilica, the Holy See shielded him from communist prosecutors, while Western governments used communications networks and refugee programs to manage the fallout. When a Chilean militant banged on a Vatican office in Santiago, church staff had seconds to decide, but once that door closed, telexes, cables, and UN offices began to move, turning a single frightened life into a case in a global system of asylum and resettlement. When Noriega slipped through the gates of the nunciature, the Vatican's legal shield gave him days, but American satellites, special forces, and negotiators ensured that those days would end in a surrender, not in a permanent sanctuary. For Americans watching these stories, the emotional arc is similar to those World War II narratives where German officers suddenly realize they're up against a U.S. industrial and technological machine they can't match. In this Cold War and post-Cold War context, the shock is not on a battlefield lined with tanks. It's in courtrooms, chancelleries, and embassy gardens where dictators and party bosses discover that the tools they thought would protect them, control of armies, control of streets, control of courts, are not enough against an adversary that has mastered law, information, and technology. The Soviet Union prided itself on rockets and parades, but it never built anything like the web of institutions and systems that let the West, led by the United States, handle flows of people and crises of asylum at this level of sophistication. It did not have a Vatican playing a semi-independent moral role inside its bloc, nor did it have a culture of transnational NGO and church networks feeding into data-rich humanitarian responses. So when Soviet diplomats in New York or Geneva heard yet another case raised, a bishop sheltered by Catholic institutions, a dissident shepherded through an embassy to exile, a dictator coaxed out of a nunciature by a mix of sermon and psychological operations, they weren't just annoyed, they were glimpsing the outlines of a world order that ran on rules, norms, and technologies in which they were always one step behind. That is where pride and fascination meet for an American audience. Pride, because the United States did not win these confrontations simply by being bigger or louder. It won them by investing in the unseen infrastructure of power, communications, law, diplomacy, logistics, intelligence. It built the computers that processed refugee lists, the spy satellites that watched troop movements, the training programs that taught special forces how to besiege an embassy without violating it. Fascination, because the key moments often hinged on tiny human acts. A Vatican official in Rome deciding to hide a controversial bishop in an extraterritorial basilica, a nun in Santiago opening a side door of a convent to let in a man on a death list, a papal nuncio in Panama choosing to let a dictator over his threshold, not to save him forever, but to engineer a surrender that would respect both law and mercy. Curiosity, because behind each of those acts lies a web of decisions, treaties, and technologies that most people never see, and yet those are exactly the levers that bent the Cold War world. In the end, the story of Vatican diplomatic immunity in the Cold War and its aftermath is not just a story about a tiny city-state protecting its own. It is a story about how, in a century obsessed with raw power, rules and information quietly tilted the balance, about how a door with a coat of arms could become a frontier between oppression and escape, and about how, again and again, when that door opened, the United States and its allies were ready on the other side, with planes, computers, courtrooms, and cameras to turn each escape, each exile, each surrender into another chapter in the long, complicated victory of the free world. Sources used for historical facts in this script include research on Catholic humanitarianism and Vissarion Poo's protection, diplomatic asylum law, Chilean refugees and embassy asylum after 1973, and detailed accounts of Noriega's refuge and surrender in the Vatican nunciature during Operation Just Cause.